Hi everybody, this is Tacitus Today at your Pushback Business channel. Thank you for watching, and while you're with us, please take a moment to subscribe below. In this essay, we're going to look at international trade tariffs and issues surrounding President Trump's tariffs on steel and aluminium being imported into the United States. Much of the mainstream media has taken the globalist scripted response, which is a nonsense narrative. Absolute nonsense. It's routinely anti-Trump and suggests some sort of Armageddon trade war is just around the corner, and somehow it's all the fault of President Trump by upsetting all those other angelic free trading nations. That's nonsense, and completely reject that narrative. No country in the world is a perfect or even majority free trader. Not one. And they all use some form of tariffs or tariff equivalency. As free trade goes, the United States is amongst the freest trading nations on the planet. Ironically, if not hypocritically, most attacks on President Trump's tariff remarks have come from nations that are amongst the biggest covert trade protectionists on the planet. Along with tariffs, there is a raft of under-the-radar trade protection tools used by all trading nations to protect local industries and to subsidise exports. So let's look at how nations engage in trade protection and the devices they use, whether being upfront about it, such as using tariffs as President Trump suggests, or on the backhand using more covert methods. So just going through a list here. One is, of course, tariffs on imports, which President Trump is proposing here. And that's quite simple. As goods are coming into the country, into the United States in this instance, a tariff or a cost of importing is put on, which is a percentage of the value of the invoice value of the goods coming in. So say an item is $100, then a 20% tariff will be $20. So it costs $120 to bring that item or those items into the country. The second is quotas, restricting the amount of imports in any category by volume. Now, what this is designed to do is, particularly in the case of seasonal goods, quotas restrict the amount of things that can come in. They don't change the price, but they say you can only bring in 1,000 of these units or 10,000 units, or whatever the case may be, or you can only bring them in at certain times of the year. This could be, say, in fresh produce, for example, that might be in season somewhere else in the world, but not in season in the United States, and so those items can come in, but there are quotas to say, okay, you can only bring these items in the off season. So that quotas are quite a popular one, along with tariffs. Government exchange rate manipulation to make imports more expensive and exports cheaper. Now, this is a little bit more complicated here, but what governments tend to do is they devalue their currency. They devalue it relative to the US dollar. So this makes their exports cheaper because they've devalued their currency. But when exporters from another country want to send their goods in, then it makes those goods more expensive. Because when you devalue your currency, you make your stuff cheaper. But when people want to bring goods in, it makes the other goods more expensive. And this is Asian nations in particular have, since World War II, have used the exchange rate manipulation method to make their exports cheaper and develop their export industry. Japan used it, Taiwan used it, Malaysia used it, and so on. But this usually comes at the cost of the nations that they're sending to. Now, exporting their goods to. Now, in the case of China and places like India, they've got these huge workforces and labour forces they all want to bring into a first world trading system, and that's fine, but it could take 100 years. Now, the United States economy can't afford to hollow itself out of the Western economies, so they can't carry that many people wanting to be brought into the first world economy. So there has to be at some point at which it has to stop. So this government exchange rate manipulation, say in nations like China, it's really costing a lot of jobs in the United States and the West, and things need to change. And there's been a lot of press about that over the years. And another method, direct subsidies to industries or corporations, and using price controls. What this is where a government, particularly where the enterprise may be, say, state-owned or semi-state-owned or something like that, the government will directly subsidise the production. Now, it may be done through indirect methods, such as the government say, we'll pay for training, or we'll pay for new machinery or new equipment. So they can argue that, well, we're not helping export, we're not making those products cheaper, but really they're taking up costs that business would have to absorb in the real world. So they're taking up those costs so that that business can export goods for a much cheaper price because they don't have to meet the normal costs of production and doing business. Or the government provides price control, so that allows the business to sell in the domestic market at much higher prices, so they have an artificially high profit, which they then put back into making artificially cheap exports. The next one is government conscription of workers at artificially low wages. Now, this is very much the case in some of these developing economies where there are hundreds of millions of underemployed or unemployed workers, or workers that are working on farms for subsistence type wages or subsistence existence, hand to mouth. And what they want to do is bring these workers into the city to work for a couple of bucks a day or something like that in factories. So the government conscripts these workers. They bust them into the cities, or they put them up in little shoebox type accommodation. They put them in there on these very low wages, and that creates a much lower cost of production, of course, for these people. And a lot of these guys people are working 6 or even 7 days a week, 10, 12 hours a day. They maybe only get half an hour off for some lunch, and they've got to eat their lunch off drums of chemicals and things like that. It's a very poor working conditions, but it artificially lowers the price of production. Another way is covert support for local monopolies, oligopolies or cartels. Again, this is particularly in developing economies where there's a lot of cronyism, government hacks and flunkies being given cosy gigs or companies to run. So these monopolies, oligopolies or cartels can artificially push up the price of goods in the local economy while using that extra profit to subsidise and artificially subsidise exports. Tax breaks or targeted tax breaks and incentives resulting in lower effective tax rates. Now, a lot of nations do this, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with it as long as they're all upfront about it. But these targeted tax breaks can give accelerated tax write-offs or tax holidays or certain profits not being taxed if they're from, say, exports, various incentives to export, such as every ton of goods that's exported, there's a few $100 that's given in a tax break, which they can roll on into following tax years and so on. So this lowering of tax rates can be translated straight into a lower cost of overall production or cost of doing business, and thus a lower cost or a lesser cost associated with exporting any goods that they produce. Another method is a consumption tax on imports, but in the case where a local producer then wants to export products, that any consumption tax they may have paid and all taxes in that chain there can be credited back, thus making the exports cheap but artificially increasing the price of imports. Another method is punitively high administrative, storage and processing fees on imports. This is done through, for example, having a particular point of processing for imports, which may be very slow. It's understaffed. It can take months to process imports coming through there. Through such a narrow aperture into that country, and so then an importer is forced to store their goods in that country or area where they're waiting for the administrative process to work through, and so this artificially increases the cost on imports without actually putting a tariff on them. So in some countries they can hold imports up for months. And then with the storage costs and the delays, the cost of having all that money sitting there that can't be translated into cash flow. Of course, it's a very high cost of doing business. So this adds a cost to imports, and that's just another. It's effectively a tariff and a quota all rolled into one. There's other structural impediments that are used, such as forcing imports through pricey local distribution monopolies. The Japanese used to use this to great effect a few decades ago, and even to some extent today, where if you were importing or bringing goods into Japan from say the United States or elsewhere, you're forced to use local distribution channels and local distribution monopolies and methods that were quite pricey. Now, the local manufacturers didn't have to use those same distribution processes or could do so at a much lower price or could claim high levels of tax deductibility. So that meant that when goods came in from outside Japan, they were forced to go through these distribution monopolies that artificially increased the price of imports, which made the Japanese products, of course, more competitive and thus more desirable to the domestic consumer. Similar to number 9 there, the high administrative costs requiring importers to go through lengthy and opaque local approvals processes. This again is a great way for holding up imports and just making it long and difficult and troublesome to bring products in. Often this is in third world or developing economies where local officials want bribes and things like that. So this all adds to the time, the tying up of cash, the cost of transporting, cost of storage and so on. The last one, demanding importers pay big ticket bribes to local politicians or charities, for example, they control. This is quite a favourite, particularly again in the developing economies where there's a lot of cronyism. Local politicians or party heavyweights will have charity-type front companies they control, which employ their family members and good friends and mistresses and concubines and so on. So they demand importers pay a lot of money to these front organisations, and that's another way of adding to the cost of importing. And if the importer doesn't pay or doesn't pay enough or doesn't do it with a big smile on their face, they can have import licences refused or held up in red tape and so on. Now, make no mistake, every nation engages in some form of trade protection, so it's largely disingenuous for other trading nations to question or condemn President Trump when they too are doing the same thing. To understand trade protection in the present day, we need to first understand we're in unique times. Before the early 1990s, there was the rich Western nations, including Japan, all with similar standards of living and similar cost structures. This includes the United States, Germany, Britain, Canada, Australia, and so on. And then there were the much poorer communist or socialist bloc nations, including the Russian Soviet Union, China, the then Yugoslavia, parts of Eastern Europe, sort of semi-communist India, and some independent economic microstates existed, or commodity-specific states, such as the Middle East and oil and so on, and then the basket case economies of Africa. Trade between nations of similar per capita wealth and technological advancement, similar cost and social legal structures, is commercial competition of differentiation between innovation, invention, and looking for that next technical frontier and that next commercial niche. It's trading between equals. As cost structures and advanced technology between, say, the G20 nations are approximately the same, innovation, whether technical or organisational, becomes the primary commercial differentiator. It's not cheap wages or something like that, it's innovation and it's finding that next technical frontier. But trade between nations with very different cost structures is quite another matter. Then in the early 1990s, in a sudden unexpected spurt, China, India, Russia and a host of smaller nations such as Bulgaria, Albania, Slovenia joined the global capitalist market with, in nearly all cases, nothing to offer the world trading community except their cheap labour. Notable exceptions such as the impressive Skoda works of the Czech Republic existed, but such examples are rare indeed. To place this event in 1990 or the early 1990s in perspective, the world capitalist workforce increased by almost 800% within 2 to 3 years. China alone had a workforce of some 750 plus million. That was more workers than the entire Western Bloc combined. India, a similar number, and then millions more from Russia and Eastern Europe and so on. So you had two hugely mismatched economic worlds, and they collided, the advanced and rich Western world and the new world, or the former communist world, which had very minimal international purchasing power, but a wage rate 1/12 or less that of the Western economies. These developing economies not only had huge pools of workers, but could work them for $2 or less per hour in some cases even $2 a day, and then for 10 plus hours a day, 6 days a week, post them overnight in shoebox dormitories or have them sleep on the floor next to a workbench. First to third world wage differential alone, though, does not account for the difference in prices. In first stage steel processing, for example, labour costs are around 10 to 15% of the total price. Combined with careless attitudes to pollution and worker health and safety, developing economies maintained a cheap wage and a considerable lower cost of production advantage with which the West could not possibly compete on a cost of inputs model of production. It's very important to remember that, a cost of inputs model of production. In addition, the developing economies subsidised exports and manipulated exchange rates to make exports artificially cheaper while placing many procedural and administrative obstacles to stymie certain categories of American or first world imports. Many export industries in certain developing economies are state-owned. They receive soft government loans, they use flaky accounting procedures and are not required to make a commercial profit. In reality, the product they make and export is shipped to the West at dumping prices. In the case of steel, China might export minimally or first stage processed steel to, say, Mexico or Canada for final processing, which is then re-exported to the United States. This backdoor method can still equate to billions of dollars of steel and aluminium from the third world being under the table into the US. Many developing economies manufacture products such as steel to a minimal standard of quality, often resulting in a very high level of rejects. You don't want substandard steel going to, say, skyscrapers or building bridges and so on. Other finished products in categories such as textiles are produced to a manifestly lower quality standard with cheaper fabric, single pass stitching, poor quality dye and so on. So much so that, for example, in the case of textile items from a developing economy, while cheaper to buy, they must be replaced 3 or 4 times more often than the higher quality Western manufactured item. As well as the false economy of buying cheaper but significantly inferior products, the advanced economies such as the US in effect exported more than 30 million manufacturing and manufacturing support services jobs to the developing parts of the world between 2001 and 2016, and that number of 30 million is quite conservative. These jobs were generally replaced, if at all, with menial service jobs that paid 40% or less than the manufacturing jobs that had been exported. Many more new manufacturing jobs that would have been created or stayed in the West were also lost. The lost American taxes alone on these exported jobs comes to tens of billions over the period. When President Trump talks about some parts of the world getting a free ride from the American economy, he's talking about the anti-competitive trade practices of other regions, developing nations or not, that place American manufacturers at an unfair trade commercial disadvantage. These anti-competitive practices from other regions that put American workers at a disadvantage include the artificially low exchange rates, as well as government underwritten soft loans, tax incentives and subsidies, as well as preventing or obstructing competing imports. And as mentioned above, they are all doing it to varying degrees. Placement of tariffs for goods entering America may not necessarily increase prices at all, or perhaps minimally. In practical terms, a tariff means local American manufacturers will sell more product. That is, they have a larger market share, which means they can realise economies of scale and productivities that a smaller market share would restrict. Therefore, given the proportion of steel involved in various products, the price of an average car may theoretically increase by $20 or so. But in return, America gains many new jobs from workers who pay income taxes and buy cars. The tariffs on steel and aluminium proposed by President Trump are fully justified under the circumstances to produce maximum value for America and Americans. However, they must be temporary until the steel industry is fully restructured and or until international trade is properly rebalanced. Tariff protection, yes, but only in return for a competitive industry delivering world competitive pricing, world quality steel to American industry and American consumers. If the globalist view of free trade is America loses millions of well-paid jobs just so folks can buy a car for $20 or so less, then who would really want that? Provided the steel and aluminium manufacturers use the tariff protection wisely to efficiently rebuild a fully price quality competitive international industry and not to use the opportunity to hide behind a tariff wall to become inefficient and lazy along with huge CEO bonuses. If the industry can avoid those temptations, the strategic tariffs will be an inspired and immensely worthwhile initiative by the President and one we should all support. Tightly targeted strategic limited time term tariffs are a great way to rebuild decimated Western industries that for years have been forced to compete with peasant wage economies. This may be an exciting exercise in rebalancing that is long overdue, and President Trump is leading the way. When this tariff protection is removed at some point in the future, the US steel and aluminium industry should be amongst the most competitive price-quality steel manufacturers on the planet. You've been with Tacitus Today at your Pushback Business channel, and thank you for watching. If you find our essays informative, please subscribe below. And please remember this and other essays are available in printed or ebook format. Thank you.